In the cold twilight of a European winter, as 1945 dawned across a continent ravaged by years of warfare, the Nazi empire that had once stretched from the Atlantic coast to the gates of Moscow was crumbling. The Third Reich, which Hitler had boasted would last 1,000 years, was in its death throes. From the east, the Soviet Red Army pushed relentlessly westward through Poland, their boots crunching through snow stained with the evidence of Nazi atrocities. From the west, American, British, and Canadian forces pressed into Germany itself, their advance unstoppable, their resolve hardened by years of brutal combat. Between these two massive pincers of Allied military power lay a secret that the Nazi leadership had desperately tried to conceal. A network of horror that even the battle-hardened soldiers advancing across Europe could not have imagined in their darkest nightmares. For more than a decade, since the first concentration camp opened at Dachau in 1933, the Nazi regime had constructed an elaborate system of imprisonment, slave labour, and murder. What had begun as camps to detain political opponents had metastasized into something far more sinister, an industrial-scale apparatus of genocide that would ultimately claim millions of lives. By 1945, there were thousands of these sites scattered across occupied Europe, from massive complexes like Auschwitz-Birkenau that could hold over 100,000 prisoners to smaller subcamps and labour sites where inmates were worked to death in service of the German war machine. The camp system included not only concentration camps, but also 6 dedicated killing centres, places designed for no purpose other than mass murder. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec, Chelmno, and Majdanek. These names would become synonymous with the Holocaust, with the systematic attempt to annihilate European Jewry. As Allied forces advanced in late 1944 and early 1945, the SS leadership faced a dilemma. They needed slave labour to continue Germany's doomed war effort, yet they also feared what would happen if these prisoners, living witnesses to Nazi crimes, fell into Allied hands. The solution they devised was as cruel as it was chaotic: the forced evacuation of prisoners from camps near the front lines, marching them deeper into the shrinking Reich. These forced marches would become known to history as the Death Marches, and they would claim the lives of 250,000 people in the final months of the war. But despite all efforts to hide the evidence, to march the prisoners away, to destroy the gas chambers and crematoriums, to burn documents and bury the dead, the truth could not be suppressed. As Allied soldiers pushed forward in their campaigns to defeat Nazi Germany, they began to encounter the concentration camp system firsthand. What they found would shock the world and provide undeniable evidence of crimes so vast, so systematic, so deliberately cruel that a new word would have to be coined to describe them: genocide. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps would become one of the most significant moments of the 20th century. A confrontation with evil that would fundamentally alter how humanity understood the depths to which civilization could descend. The winter of 1945 was particularly harsh. Snow fell heavily across Central and Eastern Europe, blanketing the landscape in white that seemed to mock the darkness of what lay beneath. The prisoners in the concentration camps, already weakened by years of starvation, disease, and brutal treatment, faced the prospect of another winter with dread. Many would not survive to see liberation. But for those who did, for those who somehow found within themselves the strength to endure just a few more weeks, just a few more days, freedom was coming. It was coming in the form of Soviet T-34 tanks rumbling across the frozen Polish plains. It was coming in the form of American jeeps and trucks winding through the German countryside. It was coming in the form of British forces pressing through the forests and fields of northern Germany. Liberation was coming, though what it would mean, what horrors it would reveal, no one could fully anticipate. The death marches, as the Soviet offensive launched in January 1945, punching through German lines with overwhelming force, SS leadership scrambled to evacuate the camps in the path of the advance. At Auschwitz-Birkenau, the largest killing center in the Nazi system, the order came on January 17th. The prisoners, those deemed strong enough to walk, were to be evacuated immediately. There was no time for preparation, no provision for the journey ahead. Prisoners who had been starving for years, many ill with typhus or tuberculosis, were forced to line up in the bitter cold and begin marching west. They wore thin, striped uniforms that provided virtually no protection against the elements. Many had no proper shoes, only wooden clogs or rags wrapped around their feet. Some walked in bare feet, leaving bloody prints in the snow. The evacuation of Auschwitz involved approximately 60,000 prisoners. They were divided into columns and sent in different directions, some toward the rail junction at Wodzisław, about 39 miles away, others to Gliwice, 34 miles distant. The march began in the depths of winter, with temperatures well below freezing. As the columns stretched out along the roads of Upper Silesia, a horrifying pattern emerged. Anyone who fell behind, anyone who stumbled or collapsed from exhaustion, was shot by the SS guards escorting the march. The guards had orders to leave no one alive who could not continue. The roads became lined with bodies, frozen corpses left where they fell, marking the route of suffering like grotesque milestones. One survivor of the Auschwitz death march, Thomas Bürgenthal, was just 10 years old when he was forced on the march with his father. Though they were initially together, they were soon separated in the chaos. Thomas remembered the cold most vividly, the way it seemed to penetrate to his very bones, the way his feet became numb and then began to burn with pain as he forced himself to keep moving. He saw people shot for stopping, saw bodies accumulate in ditches along the roadside. The march seemed endless, a nightmare journey through a frozen hell where death was always one moment of weakness away. Of the 60,000 who left Auschwitz on these marches, approximately 15,000 died before reaching their destinations. Their bodies were left in the snow, a trail of death stretching across the Polish winter landscape. Those who survived the march to the rail junctions were then packed into open freight cars, exposed to the elements for days, as the trains slowly made their way to concentration camps deeper in Germany. Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, Flossenburg, and Bergen-Belsen all received transports of these emaciated, frozen survivors. Many more died in the freight cars, succumbing to cold, starvation, or disease. When the trains finally arrived at their destinations, the cars were opened to reveal scenes of horror. Piles of frozen bodies stacked in the corners, a few survivors clinging to life among the dead. One such train would later be discovered by American forces near Dachau. A death train that became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence of Nazi brutality. 39 cars filled with over 2,000 corpses. The Stutthof camp, located near Gdansk on the Baltic coast, began its evacuation in late January as Soviet forces approached from the east. The evacuation of Stutthof was particularly brutal, even by the standards of the death marches. In the first wave of killing, the SS took approximately 5,000 prisoners from the subcamps of Stutthof, marched them to the frozen shore of the Baltic Sea, and forced them into the icy water. Machine guns opened fire, cutting down those who struggled in the waves. The bodies were left to wash ashore or sink beneath the ice. For those remaining in the main camp, the evacuation began on January 25. They were forced to march westward toward Lauenburg, a distance of some 70 to 80 miles. The column of prisoners, tens of thousands strong, struggled through snowstorms and sub-zero temperatures. The SS guards showed no mercy. Anyone who couldn't maintain the pace was shot immediately. Manfred Goldberg, a teenager at the time, remembered that the march seemed to have no destination, no plan. They walked during the day and tried to find shelter at night, often in barns or abandoned buildings. Food was almost non-existent. Prisoners died of exposure, of starvation, of exhaustion. When they finally reached Lauenburg, they found their path blocked by advancing Soviet forces. The SS turned them around and marched them back towards Stutthof. This back and forth march, this aimless wandering in the snow, claimed thousands of additional lives. It was a death march in the most literal sense, a forced march with no destination except death. Of the approximately 50,000 prisoners who had been in the Stutthof camp system in January 1945, it is estimated that over 25,000, approximately half, died during the evacuation. Some managed to escape into the forests and survived by hiding until Soviet forces liberated the area. Others were eventually loaded onto ships in late April as the camp became completely surrounded by Soviet forces. Even then, the killing continued. Guards forced hundreds more prisoners into the Baltic and shot them. The few thousand who were transported by ship to other camps faced overcrowded, disease-ridden conditions that claimed even more lives. The death march from Buchenwald began on April 7th as American forces approached from the west. Despite attempts by the prisoners to delay and sabotage the evacuation, the SS succeeded in forcing approximately 28,000 prisoners out of the camp. They were marched toward rail stations where they would be loaded onto trains destined for other camps. Along the route, SS guards, Volkssturm militia, and even Hitler Youth members participated in killing prisoners who could not continue. It is estimated that about 1,000 prisoners died on this march, shot by their guards or succumbing to exhaustion. From Ravensbrück women's camp, 24,000 female prisoners were sent on death marches in late March 1945. The SS wanted to empty the camp before Soviet forces arrived. The women, many of them already desperately ill and weak, were forced to walk north in columns. The guards showed particular cruelty, shooting women who fell behind or who tried to help others who had collapsed. Soviet forces eventually liberated the survivors of this march on April 30th, finding them scattered along roads and huddled in forests, barely alive. The death marches represented one of the final, desperate acts of Nazi genocidal policy. They served multiple purposes for the SS leadership. First, they preserved slave labor that could still be used in German factories and construction projects. Second, they prevented camp prisoners from falling into Allied hands, where they could testify to what they had witnessed. Third, they eliminated through death those prisoners too weak to be of further use. The marches were characterized by chaos and lack of planning. Food, water, and shelter were not provided. Guards had vague orders to move prisoners west or south, but often had no specific destination in mind. The result was a scattered, disorganized killing spree that left bodies strewn across the German countryside in the final months of the war. For the prisoners forced on these marches, survival depended on a combination of physical strength, luck, and sheer will. Many spoke later of entering a kind of trance state, putting one foot in front of the other automatically, focusing entirely on the simple act of continuing to move forward. To stop was to die. To show weakness was to die. To try to escape was almost certainly to die. Yet some did try, and some succeeded. They slipped away from the columns when guards were not watching, hid in forests or in the homes of sympathetic civilians, and waited for liberation to reach them. But for everyone who escaped, dozens more perished on the roads. The death marches of 1945 ultimately claimed the lives of approximately 250,000 prisoners from the concentration camp system. This figure represents nearly 1/3 of all prisoners who were still alive in the camps at the start of 1945. They died of gunshot wounds, of exposure to freezing temperatures, of starvation, of disease, of exhaustion. Their bodies were buried in mass graves, burned in the forests, or simply left where they fell. German civilians watched these columns of skeletal figures in striped uniforms shuffle past their homes and claimed after the war that they did not know what was happening. But the evidence was there for anyone to see. The death marches passed through towns and villages across Germany and Austria. The bodies lined the roads. The survivors who reached other camps arrived as living skeletons. The crime was committed in broad daylight, visible to all. Majdanek, the first liberation. On July 23, 1944, Soviet forces advancing through eastern Poland reached the city of Lublin. Just outside the city lay the Majdanek concentration camp and killing center. Unlike the other major camps that the Germans would later attempt to destroy, Majdanek was captured virtually intact. The speed of the Soviet advance had surprised the Nazi command. They had begun evacuating the camp in April, sending most of the prisoners west to other camps. They had attempted to demolish some of the gas chambers and crematoriums, but when Soviet scouts approached the camp on the night of July 22nd, they found that the hasty demolition had been incomplete. The evidence of mass murder was still there, undeniable and overwhelming. The soldiers of the Red Army entered Majdanek on July 23rd and found approximately 1,000 prisoners still in the camp, mostly Soviet POWs who were too ill to be evacuated. These survivors, emaciated and dressed in filthy striped uniforms, greeted their liberators with tears and cries of joy. Some could barely speak, weakened by years of starvation and abuse. The Soviet soldiers, hardened by years of brutal warfare on the Eastern Front, were nevertheless shocked by what they encountered. This was something different from the horrors of combat. This was systematic, industrial murder. As Soviet officers began to inspect the camp, the scale of the atrocity became clear. They found 5 large crematorium ovens, still containing charred human remains. They found gas chambers equipped with shower heads through which Zyklon B poison gas had been introduced. They found warehouses filled with the possessions of the murdered, hundreds of thousands of pairs of shoes, mountains of clothing, suitcases marked with the names of their owners. They found documents, incomplete attempts to burn records that nonetheless revealed the systematic nature of the killing. The camp had been in operation since 1941, and during that time, it had served as both a concentration camp and a killing center. Approximately 78,000 people had been murdered at Majdanek, most of them Jews, but also Polish political prisoners, Soviet POWs, and others deemed enemies of the Reich. Soviet authorities immediately recognized the propaganda value of Majdanek. They invited journalists, including Western correspondents, to tour the camp and document what they found. Within days, reports began to appear in newspapers around the world describing the gas chambers, the crematoriums, and the mountains of victims' belongings. Film footage was shot showing the ovens, the barracks where prisoners had been crammed together in inhuman conditions, the barbed wire fences and watchtowers. For many people in the West, these reports from Majdanek were the first concrete evidence of the Nazi extermination program. There had been reports before, rumours and fragmentary accounts from escapees, but they had often been dismissed as exaggerations or wartime propaganda. Now there was a camp that could be inspected, evidence that could be photographed and filmed, survivors who could testify to what they had experienced. The liberation of Majdanek was significant not only because it was the first major camp liberated, but because it provided the first complete picture of the camp system. The presence of both gas chambers and a crematorium in close proximity left no doubt about the purpose of these facilities. The careful sorting of victims' belongings into warehouses indicated the systematic, organised nature of the killing. The documentary evidence, though incomplete, showed that this was not the random violence of war, but a deliberate program of extermination. Soviet investigators began the work that would later continue at other camps and eventually culminate in the Nuremberg Trials, documenting the crimes, gathering evidence, recording testimony. For the Soviet soldiers who liberated Majdanek, the experience was profoundly disturbing. Many wrote in letters home about what they had seen, describing the horror of walking through barracks filled with bunks where prisoners had died, of seeing the ovens that had burned human bodies, of meeting survivors who were barely more than skeletons. Some Soviet newspapers published accounts of Majdanek, though the articles often failed to specifically mention that the majority of victims were Jewish, instead referring to them as Soviet citizens or peaceful inhabitants. This was in keeping with Soviet policy of downplaying Jewish identity in favor of emphasizing Soviet patriotism, but it had the effect of obscuring the specific targeting of Jews that was at the heart of the Nazi extermination program. In the months following the liberation of Majdanek, Soviet forces continued their advance westward, liberating other camps and sites of mass murder. They found killing fields where thousands had been shot and buried in mass graves. They found smaller concentration camps and forced labor sites. But Majdanek remained the most complete example of the Nazi camp system that had yet been discovered, a place where the full machinery of genocide could be examined and documented. It stood as a preview of what Allied forces would find in the months ahead as they pushed deeper into Nazi-held territory. Auschwitz. Liberation in the snow. On January 27, 1945, soldiers of the Soviet First Ukrainian Front approached the Auschwitz camp complex in southern Poland. They had been advancing rapidly, pushing the German army back in the Vistula-Oder offensive. As they neared the town of Oświęcim, which the Germans called Auschwitz, they began to encounter evidence of something terrible. There were abandoned buildings, hastily evacuated. There were railway cars sitting on sidings, some of them filled with the belongings of prisoners. There was an acrid smell in the air, a combination of chemicals and something else, something organic and disturbing. The soldiers were approaching the largest killing center in the Nazi system, a place where over 1 million people had been murdered. The first Soviet troops entered Auschwitz in the mid-afternoon, approximately 3 in the afternoon. The main camp, Auschwitz I, was quiet. Most of the SS guards had fled days earlier. The soldiers began cautiously moving through the camp, rifles ready, uncertain what they would find. Then they began to see the prisoners. Skeletal figures in striped uniforms emerged from barracks, moving slowly, hesitantly, as if they could not believe what they were seeing. Some cried out in Russian, greeting the soldiers as liberators. Others simply stood and stared, unable to process that their long nightmare might finally be ending. The Soviet soldiers found approximately 7,000 prisoners still in the Auschwitz complex, most of them in the main camp and in Birkenau. These were the prisoners who had been too ill or too weak to be included in the evacuation marches that had left 10 days earlier. As the soldiers moved through the camp, the scale of what had occurred began to become clear. They found warehouses containing thousands of men's suits, over 348,000 of them, meticulously sorted and stored. They found over 836,000 women's coats. They found tens of thousands of pairs of shoes, mountains of them, some tiny shoes that had belonged to children. They found 7 tons of human hair, cut from the heads of victims and prepared for shipment to Germany where it would be used to make cloth. The hair was still stored in bags, awaiting transport. The systematic nature of the killing was evident in every detail. The careful sorting of the victims' belongings, the industrial scale of the murder. In Birkenau, the larger section of the Auschwitz complex where the gas chambers and crematoriums had been located, the damage from the SS's attempted destruction was evident. The Germans had dynamited the gas chambers and crematoriums in November 1944, trying to destroy the evidence of what had been done there, but they had not had enough time to complete the job. The ruins of the killing facilities still stood, damaged but recognizable. Soviet investigators could still see the underground undressing rooms where victims had been told they were going to take showers, could still see the remains of the gas chambers where Zyklon B had been introduced through vents in the ceiling, could still see the ovens where bodies had been burned. The scale of the operation was staggering. At the peak of its operation in 1944, Auschwitz-Birkenau had been able to murder and cremate several thousand people per day. The survivors found at Auschwitz were in desperate condition. Many were suffering from typhus, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Starvation had reduced them to walking skeletons, their bodies having consumed their own muscle tissue in a desperate attempt to survive. Some were so weak they could not leave their bunks. The Soviet medical personnel who arrived with the liberating forces immediately began trying to provide care, but the challenges were immense. The prisoners needed food, but their stomachs could not handle regular meals after years of starvation. They needed medicine, but supplies were limited and the front lines were still active nearby. They needed warmth, but fuel was scarce. Despite the best efforts of Soviet doctors and nurses, hundreds of survivors died in the days and weeks following liberation, their bodies simply too damaged to recover. General Vasily Petrenko, commander of the 107th Rifle Division, was among the Soviet officers who toured Auschwitz shortly after liberation. He later recalled his shock at what he saw. He had seen death throughout the war, had commanded troops through some of the most brutal battles on the Eastern Front, but nothing had prepared him for Auschwitz. The deliberate, systematic nature of the killing, the targeting of women and children, the industrial efficiency of the gas chambers and crematoriums, all of it filled him with a kind of horror that combat had not prepared him for. He spoke with survivors, listening through interpreters as they described what had happened at the camp. Their testimony revealed that Auschwitz had been operating as a killing center since 1942, that the majority of those brought to the camp had been sent directly to the gas chambers without even being registered as prisoners, that the selection process had sent children, the elderly, and those deemed too weak to work immediately to their deaths. Soviet investigators began documenting what they found at Auschwitz. They took photographs of the ruins of the gas chambers, of the mountains of belongings, of the survivors in their striped uniforms. They collected documentary evidence, finding some records that the SS had not had time to destroy. They took testimony from survivors, recording detailed accounts of the camp's operation, of the selection process at the ramp where incoming transports were divided into those sent to the gas chambers and those sent to the camp for forced labour, of the Sonderkommando prisoners, who had been forced to work in the gas chambers and crematoriums, removing bodies and cleaning the facilities. The evidence collected at Auschwitz would later be used at the Nuremberg Trials to document the systematic nature of the Nazi genocide. In Soviet newspapers, articles about the liberation of Auschwitz began to appear. Pravda and other papers described the horrors found at the camp, though, like the coverage of Majdanek, the articles often failed to specifically identify the Jewish victims, instead referring to them as peaceful Soviet citizens, or using other euphemistic language. This obscured the fact that Auschwitz had been primarily a centre for the murder of European Jews. That of the 1.1 million people killed there, approximately 1 million had been Jewish. Nevertheless, the reports from Auschwitz confirmed what many had suspected, that the Nazis had been engaged in systematic mass murder on an unprecedented scale. For the survivors of Auschwitz, liberation was a complex experience. There was relief, certainly, relief that they would not be killed, that the nightmare had ended. But there was also profound grief. Most of the survivors had lost their entire families, parents, spouses, children, siblings, all murdered in the gas chambers or worked to death in the camp. There was also uncertainty about the future. Where would they go? Their homes had been destroyed or taken over by others. Many came from Poland or Hungary, countries now under Soviet control. Some wanted to return home, but others feared the anti-Semitism that still existed in their home countries. For now, they remained in or near Auschwitz, receiving medical care and trying to regain their strength. But the question of what came next, of how they would rebuild their lives after such devastation, remained unanswered. The liberation of Auschwitz on January 27, 1945, has become one of the most symbolically important dates in Holocaust commemoration. It has been designated as International Holocaust Remembrance Day by the United Nations. The date marks not only the liberation of the largest Nazi killing centre, but also the moment when the full scale of the Holocaust began to be revealed to the world. What had been hidden, what had been carried out in occupied territories far from the eyes of most of the world, was now being documented, photographed, and testified to. The liberation of Auschwitz was the beginning of a reckoning with the enormity of Nazi crimes, a reckoning that would continue through the remaining months of the war and in the decades that followed. Ohrdruf. The Americans confront the horror. On April 4th, 1945, soldiers of the American 4th Armored Division and 89th Infantry Division advanced into the area near Gotha, Germany. They were part of General George Patton's Third Army, pushing rapidly through central Germany toward the heart of the Reich. Near the town of Ohrdruf, they encountered a camp that had been hurriedly abandoned by its SS guards. What they found there would lead to one of the most significant moments in documenting Nazi atrocities. This was Ohrdruf concentration camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald, and it was the first Nazi concentration camp to be liberated by American forces. The soldiers entering Ohrdruf found immediate evidence of atrocities. There were bodies everywhere. Some were piled in sheds, stacked like cordwood. 30 or 40 naked corpses sprinkled with lime in a futile attempt to reduce the stench. Some had been partially burned on wooden pyres, the SS having attempted to destroy the evidence of their crimes as they fled. The soldiers found approximately 3,000 bodies scattered around the camp, in various stages of decomposition. The smell was overwhelming, a sickly sweet odour of death that made even hardened combat veterans gag and vomit. The sight was equally horrific. These were not the bodies of soldiers killed in combat. These were emaciated figures, skeletal remains that spoke of prolonged starvation, bodies bearing marks of torture and brutality. The few surviving prisoners who were still alive in the camp told the American soldiers what had happened there. Ohrdruf had been a labour camp where prisoners were forced to work on a secret communications project for the German military, digging tunnels in nearby mountains. The work was brutal, carried out in all weather with minimal food and under constant threat of violence from the guards. As American forces approached, the SS had begun evacuating the camp on death marches, forcing the stronger prisoners to walk toward Buchenwald. Those too weak to march had been gathered in the camp's assembly ground under the pretense that they would be fed, then machine-gunned where they stood. The bodies left lying in the open were evidence of this final massacre. News of what had been found at Ohrdruf quickly reached higher command. On April 12th, just 8 days after the camp's liberation, 3 of the most senior American commanders in Europe arrived to tour the site. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, came along with General Omar Bradley and General George S. Patton. They were accompanied by photographers and journalists. What they saw that day would have a profound impact on how the liberation of the camps was documented and publicized. Eisenhower insisted on viewing every part of the camp. He walked through the barracks where prisoners had been housed in conditions of unimaginable squalor. He examined the torture implements that survivors demonstrated for him. He viewed the piles of bodies, forcing himself to look closely, even as his face went white with shock and anger. Patton, known for his toughness and his tolerance for the brutalities of war, reportedly had to step outside and vomit after entering a shed filled with corpses. But Eisenhower would not allow himself to turn away. He later explained that he examined everything deliberately in order to be able to give first-hand testimony if anyone in the future should claim that reports of Nazi atrocities were merely propaganda. After touring Ohrdruf, Eisenhower immediately cabled General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff in Washington. In his message, he described what he had seen, emphasizing that the visual evidence and testimony from survivors was so overwhelming as to leave no doubt about the deliberate and systematic nature of Nazi cruelty. He wrote that he had never been so angry in his life, that the English language lacked adequate words to describe what he had witnessed. But more importantly, Eisenhower made a specific request. He asked that Marshall arrange for members of Congress and prominent newspaper editors to be flown to Germany to see the camps for themselves. He understood that many people might find it difficult to believe the reports of Nazi atrocities, might dismiss them as wartime exaggeration. By bringing political leaders and journalists to see the evidence firsthand, he hoped to ensure that the truth would be documented and believed. Eisenhower also ordered that all American units in the area that were not actively engaged in frontline combat should be brought to Ohrdruf to tour the camp. He believed that American soldiers needed to see what they were fighting against, needed to understand the nature of the regime they were working to defeat. In the days that followed, thousands of American soldiers passed through Ohrdruf, viewing the bodies hearing the testimony of survivors, confronting the evidence of Nazi crimes. For many of these young men, far from home and wondering why they were fighting in Europe, the visit to Ohrdruf provided a stark answer. This was why. This was what had to be stopped. Eisenhower's request was quickly approved. Secretary of War Henry Stimson and President Harry Truman both endorsed the plan to bring American civilian leaders to see the camps. Within days, delegations of congressmen and journalists began arriving in Germany. They were taken to Ohrdruf and to other newly liberated camps. They saw the evidence with their own eyes, spoke with survivors, examined the documents and physical remains that testified to Nazi brutality. Their reports, published in newspapers and magazines across America, brought the reality of the concentration camps home to the American public. The photographs taken at Ohrdruf and other camps, shocking images of bodies and survivors, were published despite their disturbing nature. The decision was made that the truth must be told, no matter how horrific. The liberation of Ohrdruf and Eisenhower's response to it set the pattern for how other camp liberations would be handled. Photography and film documentation became a priority. Survivors' testimony was recorded. German civilians from nearby towns were brought to the camps and forced to view what had been done, to confront the reality of the regime they had supported. In the case of Ohrdruf, citizens from the nearby town were compelled to tour the camp and to help bury the dead. When the mayor of Ohrdruf and his wife saw what was in the camp, they returned home and hanged themselves, unable to live with the knowledge of what had occurred so close to their town. Whether this was from genuine shame or from fear of punishment is unknown, but their deaths were seen by some as a kind of admission of collective guilt. The documentation of Ohrdruf served another purpose beyond informing the public. It was also gathering evidence for war crimes trials. Even as the war continued, plans were already being made to hold Nazi leaders accountable for their actions. The careful documentation of what was found at the camps, the testimony of survivors, the photographs and films, all of this would later be used at Nuremberg and other trials to prove the systematic nature of Nazi crimes. Ohrdruf was the first in what would become a comprehensive effort to document the Holocaust and ensure that the evidence would be preserved for history. Buchenwald, liberation from within and without. On the morning of April 11, 1945, as American armored divisions of the Third Army approached the area near Weimar, Germany, a remarkable act of resistance was taking place inside Buchenwald concentration camp. The camp, which had held prisoners since 1937 and at its peak housed over 100,000 people in the main camp and its subcamps, was about to be liberated. But the liberation would come as much from within as from without. The prisoners of Buchenwald, organized into a secret resistance committee, had been preparing for this moment. They had hidden weapons, smuggled from work sites, and stolen from guards. They had formed military-style units, organizing prisoners by nationality and assigning roles for when the opportunity came to resist. And now, as the SS began to flee in the face of the American advance, that opportunity had arrived. At 10 in the morning, the order came from the SS command for all guards to leave the camp. The SS officers and guards, realizing that American forces would arrive within hours, abandoned their posts and fled. The prisoners of the International Camp Committee, the underground resistance organization, immediately sprang into action. They distributed the hidden weapons, simple firearms, and improvised weapons that had been carefully concealed for months. Armed prisoners moved to secure the watchtowers and the main gates. By 4 in the afternoon, before any American soldiers had entered the camp, the prisoners had taken control of Buchenwald. They raised flags, makeshift banners sewn in secret, declaring that the camp was free. It was an act of defiance, a reclaiming of dignity after years of degradation and abuse. Around 5 in the afternoon, American scouts from the 6th Armored Division arrived at the gates of Buchenwald. They found prisoners, not guards, manning the watchtowers. The prisoners were jubilant, celebrating their liberation and their successful uprising. But the celebration was tempered by the reality of what the American soldiers found as they entered the camp. Buchenwald held approximately 21,000 prisoners at the time of liberation. Many were barely alive, emaciated to the point that they seemed more like moving skeletons than living human beings. Disease was rampant. Typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery, and other illnesses swept through the barracks. Dead bodies lay in piles, prisoners who had died just hours or days before liberation, their bodies not yet removed because there was no longer any functioning system in the camp. The American soldiers were unprepared for what they encountered. Most had seen combat, had witnessed death and destruction on the battlefield, but this was something different. This was systematic brutality, a camp designed to break human beings through starvation, forced labor, random violence, and calculated cruelty. Soldiers walked through the barracks and saw bunks crammed with skeletal figures, multiple prisoners sharing spaces barely large enough for one person. They saw the punishment cells, tiny concrete boxes where prisoners had been locked in darkness for days or weeks. They saw the execution site where prisoners had been shot. They saw the crematorium where bodies had been burned. The camp even had pathology labs where horrific medical experiments had been conducted on prisoners. Among the prisoners liberated at Buchenwald were approximately 900 children and teenagers. They had survived through a combination of luck, the protection of adult prisoners who tried to hide and shelter them, and sheer determination. One of these young survivors was Elie Wiesel, who would later write about his experiences in the camp in his memoir Night. He was 16 years old at the time of liberation, though he looked much younger due to starvation. Photographs taken shortly after liberation show these child survivors, some orphaned, some not yet knowing whether their parents had survived, looking at the camera with eyes that had seen far too much. Their faces were gaunt, their bodies painfully thin, but they had survived. In the years to come, many of these young survivors would emigrate to Israel or the United States, would rebuild their lives, would become witnesses to what they had endured. The American military immediately began providing aid to the survivors. Army doctors and medical personnel arrived to treat the sick and injured. Food was brought in, though care had to be taken in feeding people who had been starving for years. The human digestive system cannot immediately handle rich food after prolonged starvation. Soldiers who gave their rations to prisoners out of compassion sometimes inadvertently caused harm, as the prisoners' bodies could not process the food. Special feeding programs had to be established, gradually reintroducing proper nutrition in a way that would not kill the recipients. American commanders also ordered that German civilians from the nearby city of Weimar be brought to Tour Buchenwald. General Patton insisted that 1,000 Weimar citizens be marched through the camp to see what had been happening just a few miles from their homes. The German civilians walked through in stunned silence, viewing the piles of bodies, the emaciated survivors, the crematorium ovens. Some claimed they had not known what was happening in the camp. Others admitted they had heard rumors but had not believed them, or had been too afraid to act. The forced tours were intended to confront the German population with the reality of the Nazi regime they had supported to make it impossible for them to claim ignorance. Buchenwald also became one of the most extensively documented camps. Military photographers and film crews recorded everything, from the condition of the survivors to the layout of the camp to the evidence of atrocities. Journalists were brought in to interview prisoners and document their testimony. The footage shot at Buchenwald, showing skeletal prisoners in their striped uniforms, stacks of corpses, and the physical evidence of Nazi cruelty, would be shown in movie theatres across America and Britain, bringing the reality of the camps to millions of people. It was difficult to watch, disturbing and graphic, but it was also necessary. The world needed to see what had been done. In the weeks following liberation, efforts began to help survivors reunite with family members and prepare to leave the camp. But this was a slow process. Many prisoners were too ill to be moved. Others had nowhere to go, their homes destroyed or taken over by others, their families murdered. Buchenwald remained in operation as a displaced persons camp for some time, housing survivors, while efforts were made to figure out what to do with them, where they could go, how they could rebuild their shattered lives. The question of what would happen to the survivors, how they would be cared for, and where they would settle would become one of the major humanitarian challenges of the immediate post-war period. Bergen-Belsen, the British encounter, Hell. On April 15th, 1945, British forces of the 11th Armoured Division approached Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in northern Germany. Unlike other liberations, this one had been negotiated in advance. German military representatives, aware that the camp was suffering from a massive typhus epidemic and fearing the disease would spread if the camp was taken by force, had approached the British to arrange a peaceful handover. An exclusion zone was established around the camp, a neutral area where neither side would engage in combat. This allowed the British to approach without fighting, but nothing could have prepared them for what they would find inside. As British soldiers entered Bergen-Belsen, they were immediately struck by the smell. It was the smell of death, of decomposing bodies and human waste, of disease and despair. It permeated everything, got into clothing and hair, seemed impossible to escape. Then they began to see the bodies. They were everywhere, piled outside barracks, lying in the open, stacked in mass graves that had been dug but not yet filled. There were approximately 10,000 corpses scattered throughout the camp, unburied, because the camp administration had completely collapsed in the final weeks before liberation. The living and the dead existed side by side in horrific proximity. The survivors were in catastrophic condition. The camp had been designed to hold about 10,000 people, but held more than 60,000 at the time of liberation. Prisoners were crammed into barracks with no sanitation, no running water, virtually no food. Typhus had spread through the camp like wildfire, killing hundreds of people per day in the weeks before liberation. The survivors were emaciated, covered in lice, suffering from dysentery and other diseases. Many were too weak to stand. They lay in their bunks, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bunk designed for one, unable to move. Some lay on the ground outside, having crawled out of the overcrowded barracks in search of fresh air or water. British Brigadier Glyn Hughes, Deputy Director of Medical Services for the Second Army, took charge of the relief operation. The scale of the crisis was overwhelming. 60,000 people needed immediate medical attention. There was no functioning infrastructure in the camp, no water supply, no sanitation system. Disease was rampant and spreading. The British military personnel who arrived to help were themselves at risk of contracting typhus. Despite the challenges, Hughes and his team immediately began organising a response. Medical teams were brought in, food supplies were requisitioned. Efforts began to separate the living from the dead, to provide basic sanitation, to treat the most severely ill. The task of burying the dead fell initially to SS guards who had been captured when the camp was liberated. British soldiers forced these guards at gunpoint to carry corpses to mass graves and bury them. For the British troops, many of whom were young men who had never seen such horrors, forcing the SS guards to handle the bodies of their victims provided a grim satisfaction. These guards, who had presided over the camp's descent into hell, were now compelled to deal with the results of their cruelty. German civilians from nearby towns were also brought to the camp and forced to witness what had happened and to assist in the burial efforts. But despite all efforts, people continued to die. In the days and weeks after liberation, approximately 14,000 more people died. Their bodies were too damaged, too weakened by prolonged starvation and disease, to recover even with medical care. The British medical teams did everything they could, but they were dealing with people who had been systematically starved and abused for years. One survivor later described seeing people dying with food in their hands, having finally received a meal but no longer able to digest it. The tragedy of dying just after liberation, of surviving until freedom arrived only to succumb days later, was heartbreaking for both the survivors and the liberators. British war correspondent Richard Dimbleby entered Bergen-Belsen shortly after liberation and recorded one of the most famous and powerful broadcasts about the camps. Speaking to BBC radio listeners, he described in careful, measured tones what he had seen. He described walking through the camp and seeing people too weak to move lying in the sun, described the piles of bodies, described the conditions in the barracks where the sick and the healthy were mixed together with no care provided. He described the crematoria ovens and the evidence of mass death. His broadcast was so shocking that BBC editors initially hesitated to air it, concerned that listeners would think it was exaggerated. But Dimbleby insisted that every word was true, that if anything he had understated the horror. The broadcast aired and became one of the most important pieces of reporting from the war, bringing the reality of Bergen-Belsen into British homes. Among the victims of Bergen-Belsen were Anne Frank and her sister Margot. They had been transferred to Bergen-Belsen from Auschwitz in late 1944. Both contracted typhus in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions of the camp. They died in February or March 1945, just weeks before British forces arrived to liberate the camp. Their deaths, so close to liberation, became symbolic of the millions who did not survive to see freedom. Anne's diary, which her father Otto Frank would later publish, would become one of the most widely read accounts of the Holocaust, giving a human face to the tragedy. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen was extensively documented by British Army film and photographic unit. Cameramen and photographers recorded the conditions found in the camp, the piles of bodies, the emaciated survivors. The footage was graphic and disturbing, showing naked corpses being bulldozed into mass graves, survivors so thin that their bones were visible through their skin, the overwhelming scale of death and suffering. This footage was later edited into documentary films that were shown to the British public and used as evidence at war crimes trials. The decision to document so thoroughly was deliberate. As at other camps, there was an understanding that people would find it difficult to believe what had happened unless they saw the evidence with their own eyes. British forces eventually made the difficult decision to burn Bergen-Belsen camp to the ground. The buildings were so infested with typhus-carrying lice, the sanitation situation so dire, that it was deemed impossible to make the camp safe. In May 1945, the remaining prisoners who were well enough to be moved were transferred to a nearby German military barracks that became a displaced persons camp. Then, the barracks at Bergen-Belsen were systematically burned. The destruction was filmed, showing the buildings going up in flames, eliminating the physical structures where so much suffering had occurred. But while the buildings could be destroyed, the memory of what had happened there could not be erased. Dachau, the First and the Fury. On April 29, 1945, soldiers from multiple divisions of the American 7th Army converged on Dachau concentration camp near Munich. The 42nd Infantry Division, the 45th Infantry Division, and the 20th Armoured Division all played roles in the liberation, though the question of which unit actually arrived first would remain a matter of some controversy and pride among the veterans. What is not disputed is what they found when they arrived, a scene of horror that would drive some American soldiers to acts of revenge against their prisoners. As the American forces approached Dachau, they first encountered a railway siding near the camp. On the tracks sat a long train of freight cars, 39 cars in all. The soldiers who investigated the train were hit immediately by an overwhelming stench. They opened the cars and found them filled with corpses, over 2,000 bodies of prisoners who had been evacuated from Buchenwald weeks earlier. The prisoners had been packed into the cars with no food or water, and the train had wandered from camp to camp, refused entry everywhere because of overcrowding. The people trapped in the cars had slowly died of starvation, dehydration, and disease. A few survivors had managed to escape when the train was abandoned near Dachau, but most had perished. Their bodies, in various stages of decomposition, were stacked in the cars. The sight was so horrific that some soldiers simply turned and walked away, unable to process what they were seeing. The death train was only the beginning. As the soldiers moved toward the main camp, they began to encounter more bodies. There were corpses lying along the railway tracks, people who had been shot by SS guards. There were more bodies near the camp entrance. The smell of death hung over everything, mixing with smoke from buildings that had been set on fire. When the Americans finally entered the camp proper, they found approximately 32,000 prisoners still alive, crammed into barracks designed to hold a fraction of that number. The prisoners were in desperate condition, suffering from typhus, tuberculosis, starvation, and other illnesses. Many were near death. The emotional impact on the American soldiers was profound. These were men who had fought through some of the most brutal battles of the war. They had landed at Anzio and fought up through Italy. They had survived the Battle of the Bulge. They had seen their friends killed in combat. But the deliberate cruelty of the concentration camp, the systematic reduction of human beings to walking skeletons, the evidence that this had been going on for years, filled them with a rage that some could not contain. What happened next at Dachau remains controversial. As German guards began to surrender, some American soldiers shot them. In one incident, SS guards were lined up against a wall in a coal yard and machine-gunned. The exact number killed is disputed, with estimates ranging from a few dozen to over 100. But there is no doubt that summary executions occurred. Some historians and veterans have defended these actions as a spontaneous response to the horrors the soldiers had just witnessed. Others have condemned them as war crimes, violations of the laws of war that require prisoners to be taken alive and treated humanely. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. a moment when the normal restraints of military discipline broke down in the face of overwhelming horror and rage. An official army investigation was launched into the killings at Dachau. The investigation, conducted by Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Whittaker, confirmed that SS guards had been executed after surrendering. However, no one was ever prosecuted for these actions. The army seemed to take the view that while the killings were not officially sanctioned, they were understandable given the circumstances. General Eisenhower's official communiqué about the liberation of Dachau stated that approximately 300 SS guards had been quickly neutralized, a euphemistic phrase that glossed over the violence of how they had been killed. Liberated prisoners also took revenge on some of their former captors. Guards who had been particularly brutal, the kapos who had collaborated with the SS in running the camp, were beaten or killed by prisoners in the immediate aftermath of liberation. For survivors who had been subjected to years of abuse, the opportunity for vengeance was difficult to resist. American soldiers generally did not interfere with these acts of retribution, and in some cases may have tacitly encouraged them. Beyond the violence of Liberation Day, Dachau presented American forces with a massive humanitarian crisis. The 32,000 survivors needed immediate medical care, food, and shelter. The camp was rife with disease, particularly typhus, which put both the prisoners and the liberating forces at risk. American medical personnel established treatment centers and began the slow process of rehabilitation. As at other camps, feeding the survivors had to be done carefully to avoid making their condition worse. Rich foods that soldiers might have wanted to share could kill someone who had been starving for months or years. Dachau held particular significance because it had been the first concentration camp established by the Nazis, opening in March 1933, just weeks after Hitler came to power. For 12 years, it had operated as a camp for political prisoners, Jews, Roma, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and others deemed enemies of the state. It had become the model for the entire camp system, the blueprint that was replicated across occupied Europe. Approximately 200,000 people had been imprisoned at Dachau and its subcamps during its operation. The death toll was estimated at between 28,000 and 41,000, though exact numbers are difficult to determine because records were incomplete or destroyed. The liberation of Dachau received significant attention in the American press. Photographs of the death train, of the bodies piled at the camp, of the emaciated survivors were published in newspapers and magazines across the country. Film footage shot at Dachau was incorporated into newsreels shown in movie theaters. The American public, which had been reading reports about Nazi atrocities for years, now saw visual evidence that made the reality undeniable. The images from Dachau, along with those from Buchenwald and other camps, became seared into the American consciousness, powerful evidence of why the war had been necessary, of the nature of the enemy that had been defeated. The final liberations. In the days following the liberation of Dachau, the collapse of Nazi Germany accelerated. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker in Berlin as Soviet forces closed in on the city. The war in Europe was clearly entering its final days. But even as the Nazi regime crumbled, Allied forces continued to discover more camps, more evidence of systematic atrocities, more survivors desperately in need of help. On May 5th, 1945, the American 11th Armored Division liberated Mauthausen concentration camp and its subcamp Gusen in Austria. Mauthausen had been one of the most brutal camps in the system, classified by the SS as a Grade 3 camp, meaning it was intended for those prisoners deemed most dangerous or most undesirable. The camp was built adjacent to a granite quarry, and prisoners were forced to work in the quarry in conditions of extreme brutality. They had to carry heavy stones up 186 steps, a climb that became known as the Stairs of Death because of the number of prisoners who died on them. Guards would push prisoners off the edge of the quarry, a 50-meter drop that was certain death. It was considered a form of entertainment for some guards. When American forces arrived at Mauthausen, they found approximately 20,000 prisoners still alive in the main camp and subcamps. The prisoners were in terrible condition, emaciated and ill. But they were also able to provide detailed testimony about what had occurred at the camp. Mauthausen had been in operation since 1938, and during that time approximately 90,000 people had been murdered there or had died as a result of the conditions. The camp included a gas chamber where prisoners had been killed, though most deaths had resulted from starvation, disease, and outright execution. As recently as April 28th, just days before liberation, SS functionaries had gassed 33 Austrian political prisoners in what would be the last gassing operation in the Third Reich. The liberation of Mauthausen was particularly significant for the extensive photographic documentation produced by Spanish prisoners who had been held in the camp. Francisco Boas, a Spanish Republican who had been imprisoned at Mauthausen, had managed to smuggle and hide thousands of photographs documenting life and death in the camp. These photographs would later serve as crucial evidence at war crimes trials. They showed the brutality of the camp, the emaciated condition of prisoners, the executions, and the SS officers who had presided over it all. Boix's photographs provided visual proof that complemented the testimony of survivors, making it impossible to deny what had happened. Soviet forces continued liberating camps in the east. On April 30th, they reached Ravensbrück, the largest women's concentration camp in the Nazi system. By the time they arrived, most of the prisoners had already been sent on death marches or evacuated by sea. Soviet soldiers found approximately 2,000 prisoners still in the camp, most of them too ill to be moved. In the months before liberation, between 5,000 and 6,000 women had been murdered in the Ravensbrück gas chamber as the SS attempted to reduce the camp population. The liberation of Ravensbrück revealed the particular horrors that female prisoners had endured, including forced labor, medical experiments, and systematic sexual violence. On May 9th, Soviet forces liberated Stutthof concentration camp near Gdansk, though by this point only about 100 prisoners remained alive in the camp itself. The main liberation of Stutthof's prisoners had come earlier, in late April, when Soviet forces had overtaken the Death March columns and freed the survivors they found. The liberation of Stutthof and other camps in the Baltic region completed the Soviet effort to free all Nazi camps on the Eastern Front. Also on May 9th, Soviet troops entered Theresienstadt, the camp ghetto in Czechoslovakia. Theresienstadt had been used by the Nazis as a model camp, a place they could show to Red Cross inspectors to pretend that prisoners were being treated well. In reality, conditions at Theresienstadt had been harsh, and the camp had served as a transit point for Jews being deported to Auschwitz and other killing centers. When Soviet forces arrived, they found thousands of prisoners, many of them elderly Jews from Germany and Austria, still alive in the camp. The final days of the war saw a frantic effort by SS personnel to evacuate remaining camps and destroy evidence. But the Allied advance was too rapid. Camp after camp was overrun before the SS could complete their work. In every camp, Allied forces found survivors, found evidence of mass murder, found the physical remains of the Nazi genocide. The scale of what was being revealed was staggering. This was not the random violence of war, not the collateral damage of military operations. This was systematic, organized, bureaucratically administered mass murder. It was genocide, and the evidence was overwhelming. By May 8th, 1945, Germany had officially surrendered. The war in Europe was over, but the work of dealing with the concentration camp system and its survivors had only just begun. Hundreds of thousands of people had been liberated from the camps, but they were displaced, homeless, often stateless. Many were too ill to travel. All had suffered profound physical and psychological trauma. The question of what would happen to them, where they would go, how they would rebuild their lives, would occupy Allied authorities and relief organizations for years to come. Survivor voices, liberation, day for the prisoners of the concentration camps. Liberation was a moment they had dreamed of, prayed for, and yet could hardly believe when it finally came. After years of systematic abuse, starvation and degradation, after watching friends and family members die, after being told repeatedly that they would never leave the camps alive, the arrival of Allied forces seemed almost unreal. The experience of liberation was complex, a mixture of joy, relief, grief, confusion, and profound uncertainty about the future. Eva Kor was 10 years old when she and her twin sister Miriam were liberated from Auschwitz by Soviet forces. They had been used in medical experiments by Dr. Josef Mengele, the Nazi doctor who had a particular interest in twins. Eva later recalled that on the day of liberation, she and Miriam were too weak to fully understand what was happening. They saw Soviet soldiers, but they did not immediately grasp that they were free. It took days for the reality to sink in. When it did, when they realized that no one was going to hurt them anymore, that they could walk where they wanted, that they would not be killed, the relief was overwhelming, but it was mixed with grief. Their parents and older sisters had been murdered in the gas chambers shortly after the family arrived at Auschwitz. The twins were alone in the world. Two small girls who had somehow survived when almost everyone else in their family had not. Elie Wiesel, who was 16 when Buchenwald was liberated, later wrote about looking at himself in a mirror after liberation. He had not seen his own reflection in years. The face that looked back at him was that of a stranger, a skeletal figure with hollow eyes, a corpse that was somehow still alive. His father had died just weeks before liberation, succumbing to dysentery and exhaustion. Wiesel's liberation was thus tinged with the grief of his father's death so close to freedom. In his memoir, Night, he would describe the complexity of that moment. The relief of survival mixed with the guilt of surviving when others had not. The profound disorientation of being free after years of imprisonment. Ben Helfgott was 15 when he was liberated from Theresienstadt by Soviet forces. He had survived multiple camps, including Buchenwald, before ending up at Theresienstadt. He remembered that on Liberation Day, the prisoners were almost afraid to believe it was real. There had been false hopes before, rumors that liberation was coming that turned out to be wrong. But when Soviet soldiers actually entered the camp and began distributing food, the realization hit. They were free. Ben recalled prisoners laughing and crying at the same time, overwhelmed by emotions they had suppressed for years. But he also remembered that many prisoners were too weak to celebrate. They lay in their bunks, barely alive, too exhausted to do more than whisper their thanks. Anita Lasker-Wolfish was a member of the women's orchestra at Auschwitz-Birkenau, a group of female prisoners who played music for the camp's SS officers and for prisoners being marched to the gas chambers. She had been transferred from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen shortly before the Soviet liberation, and was at Bergen-Belsen when British forces arrived. She recalled the sight of British tanks rolling into the camp, the soldiers in their uniforms, and feeling a mix of relief and fear. Relief that the nightmare was over, fear about what would happen next. Where would she go? Her parents had been murdered. Her home in Germany was gone. She was free, but free to do what? The question of what came after liberation was one that she, like thousands of others, had no answer to. Primo Levi, an Italian Jewish chemist who had been imprisoned at Auschwitz, was in the camp's infirmary when Soviet forces arrived. He was suffering from scarlet fever and was too weak to have been included in the evacuation marches. He later wrote about the 10 days between the German evacuation and the Soviet arrival as a period of strange limbo, when the camp administration had collapsed, but liberation had not yet come. Prisoners raided warehouses for food and warm clothes. Some died of illness or starvation, even in those final days. When the Soviets finally arrived, Levi recalled a sense of profound exhaustion rather than joy. He was alive, but he was also aware of all those who had not survived, of the randomness that had allowed him to live when so many others had died. Thomas Björgenthal, who had survived the death march from Auschwitz and ended up at Sachsenhausen, was liberated when Soviet forces reached that camp in April. He was 11, years old and alone, both parents having been lost during the death march. He remembered Soviet soldiers giving him chocolate and being amazed by the taste after years of eating nothing but watery soup and stale bread. But he also remembered feeling lost, not knowing what to do with his freedom. He ended up in a children's home for war orphans, where he slowly began to recover physically and to process what had happened to him. For many survivors, the immediate aftermath of liberation was characterized by a desperate search for information about family members. As soon as they were physically able, survivors began trying to find out what had happened to parents, siblings, spouses, children. They posted notices at DP camps listing their names and asking if anyone had information about their families. They listened to radio broadcasts that read out lists of survivors. They checked with relief organizations and tracing services. For most, the news was devastating. Entire families had been wiped out. Of a pre-war family of 10 or 20 people, maybe 1 or 2 had survived. The grief of this realization, that they were alone in the world, that everyone they had loved was dead, was in some ways as overwhelming as the experience of the camps themselves. Physical recovery was slow and painful. Bodies that had been starved for years could not immediately return to normal function. Survivors suffered from malnutrition-related diseases, from weakened immune systems that made them vulnerable to infection, from dental problems caused by years of inadequate nutrition, from psychological trauma that manifested in nightmares, depression, and anxiety. Many survivors would deal with the physical consequences of their imprisonment for the rest of their lives. Conditions like osteoporosis, heart disease, and digestive problems were common among survivors even decades after liberation. Yet despite everything they had endured, many survivors displayed remarkable resilience. They began to rebuild their lives slowly and painfully, but with determination. They learned new languages, trained for new professions, married, had children, created families to replace those that had been murdered. They immigrated to new countries and started over. And many felt compelled to bear witness, to tell their stories so that the world would know what had happened. In the immediate aftermath of liberation, survivors gave testimony to Allied authorities, helping to document the crimes that had been committed. In the decades that followed, many would continue to speak about their experiences, writing memoirs, giving interviews, speaking to students. Their testimony would become one of the most important sources of information about the Holocaust, personal accounts that put human faces on the statistics of genocide. The displaced persons camps. As Allied forces liberated concentration camps across Europe in the spring of 1945, they were confronted with a massive humanitarian crisis. There were approximately 7 million displaced persons in Europe, people who had been uprooted by the war and had no immediate place to go. This included concentration camp survivors, forced labourers who had been brought to Germany from across occupied Europe, prisoners of war, and people who had fled their homes to escape the fighting. Of this vast number, approximately 250,000 were Jewish survivors of the Holocaust. For these survivors, the question of what came next was particularly complex and painful. The initial Allied plan for dealing with displaced persons was simple: send them home. The military and relief organisations worked quickly to repatriate people to their countries of origin. By the end of 1945, more than 6 million displaced persons had been repatriated, most of them successfully reunited with their homelands. But for many Holocaust survivors, returning home was not an option. Their homes had been destroyed or taken over by others. Their communities had been wiped out. Many came from Poland, Hungary, Romania, and other Eastern European countries, where anti-Semitism remained strong. Jews who did try to return home sometimes faced violence, even murder, from their former neighbours who did not want to give back Jewish property they had appropriated. For these survivors who could not or would not return to their former homes, a new solution had to be found. The answer was the creation of displaced persons camps, temporary facilities where survivors could live while their long-term future was decided. These DP camps were established throughout Germany, Austria, and Italy, primarily in the American and British occupation zones. The camps varied in size and condition, some housed in former German military barracks, others in requisitioned hotels or apartment buildings, still others in parts of former concentration camps. The conditions in many DP camps were initially quite poor. In the months immediately after liberation, survivors found themselves still living behind barbed wire, still subsisting on inadequate rations, still without clarity about their future. This was particularly galling for Jewish survivors who felt they had been liberated from Nazi camps, only to be placed in camps run by the Allies. In some facilities, Jewish survivors were housed alongside ethnic German refugees and even former Nazi collaborators, a situation that caused considerable distress and anger. In June 1945, President Harry Truman asked Earl Harrison, Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School, to investigate the condition of Jewish displaced persons in Europe. Harrison spent several weeks touring DP camps in Germany and Austria. His report, submitted in August 1945, was a scathing indictment of Allied policy toward Jewish survivors. He wrote that as matters stood, it appeared that the Allies were treating Jews the same way the Nazis had treated them, except that they were not exterminating them. He described overcrowded conditions, inadequate food, lack of medical care, and most importantly, a failure to recognize Jews as a distinct group with specific needs and concerns. The Harrison report had a significant impact. President Truman forwarded it to General Eisenhower with instructions to improve conditions immediately. Eisenhower responded swiftly, ordering changes in how DP camps were administered. Jewish survivors were to be housed in separate camps from other displaced persons to protect them from anti-Semitism and to allow them to organize their own communities. Rations were increased, medical care was improved. The American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee and other Jewish relief organizations were given greater access to the camps to provide assistance. By 1946, conditions in the DP camps had improved considerably. The camps began to take on the characteristics of small towns, with their own internal organization and governance. Survivors elected committees to represent them in dealings with Allied authorities. Schools were established to educate children who had missed years of schooling during the war. Vocational training programs were set up to teach survivors new skills that would help them in whatever country they eventually settled. Cultural and religious life flourished, with theatres presenting Yiddish plays, orchestras giving concerts, synagogues being established, and newspapers being published in multiple languages. The DP camps also became centres of commemoration and documentation. Survivors began almost immediately to document what had happened during the Holocaust. They collected testimony from fellow survivors, gathered documents, held memorial services for the murdered. This documentation work was driven by a deep need to bear witness, to ensure that the world would know what had happened, to honour the memory of those who had not survived. Organisations like the Central Historical Commission gathered thousands of testimonies in the DP camps, creating an archive of survivor accounts that would be invaluable to future historians. Despite the improvements in conditions, the DP camps were always meant to be temporary. Survivors wanted to leave, to build new lives, to escape the reminders of their suffering that surrounded them in Europe. But the question of where they could go was not easily answered. Immigration to Palestine, which many survivors desired, was controlled by the British, who severely restricted Jewish immigration to avoid antagonizing Arab populations. The United States maintained strict immigration quotas that limited the number of refugees who could enter. Other countries were similarly restrictive. The result was that many survivors remained in DP camps for years. By early 1947, there were over 250,000 Jewish displaced persons in camps, with new arrivals constantly coming from Eastern Europe where pogroms and anti-Semitic violence continued even after the war. This infiltration, as it was called, of Jewish refugees from Poland and other Eastern European countries fleeing post-war anti-Semitism actually increased the DP population even as others were being resettled. The situation began to change in 1948 with two major developments. First, the United States passed the Displaced Persons Act, which allowed for the admission of over 200,000 refugees, including many Holocaust survivors. Second, and even more significantly, the State of Israel was established in May 1948. Israel immediately opened its doors to all Jewish refugees, regardless of age, health, or ability to work. This gave survivors a destination, a homeland where they would be welcome. In the years that followed, more than 650,000 Jewish refugees, including most of the DP camp survivors, immigrated to Israel. Life in the DP camps was marked by a remarkable determination to rebuild and move forward despite the trauma of the past. Survivors married and formed new families, with birth rates in the camps actually exceeding normal population growth rates, as survivors sought to replace the families they had lost. Children were born in the DP camps, new life emerging from the shadow of genocide. Cultural and educational activities thrived, with survivors creating theatre companies, orchestras, sports teams, and newspapers. There was a sense of community, of shared experience, that helped sustain people through the difficult years of waiting. By 1952, most DP camps had closed, as survivors found places to resettle. The last camp, Fürstenwald in Germany, remained open until 1957, housing the last refugees who, for various reasons, had been unable to find new homes. The DP camp period, though difficult, had served an important function. It had provided a safe space for survivors to begin recovering from their trauma, to reconnect with Jewish culture and community, and to prepare for new lives wherever they might settle. The camps had been witnesses to remarkable resilience, to the human capacity to rebuild even after the most devastating losses. Aftermath and legacy. The liberation of the Nazi concentration camps marked the end of one chapter of history and the beginning of another. The immediate task of helping survivors, of burying the dead, of documenting what had occurred, was only the first step. The world had to grapple with what these revelations meant, had to determine how to hold perpetrators accountable, had to figure out how to ensure that such atrocities would never happen again. One of the most important outcomes of the liberation was the establishment of an unprecedented documentary record. The Allies had carefully photographed and filmed what they found at the camps, had recorded the testimony of survivors, had preserved physical evidence and documents. This documentation was crucial not only for historical understanding, but also for legal proceedings. The Nazi leadership and camp personnel would be held accountable through war crimes trials, most famously the Nuremberg Trials that began in November 1945. At Nuremberg, the International Military Tribunal prosecuted major Nazi leaders for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and the crime of aggression. The evidence presented included extensive documentation from the concentration camps, film footage from the liberations, testimony from survivors, and captured German documents detailing the operation of the camp system. The trials made clear that the Holocaust had been a systematic, state-organized program of genocide, not simply the random cruelty of war. 24 major Nazi leaders were prosecuted at the first Nuremberg trial, with 12 receiving death sentences. Beyond Nuremberg, there were thousands of additional trials of Nazi perpetrators, including specific trials for personnel who had worked at the camps. The Dachau trials, conducted by American military authorities, prosecuted those responsible for atrocities at Dachau and other camps. The British conducted similar trials for Bergen-Belsen personnel, with Camp Commandant Josef Kramer and head guard Elisabeth Volkenrath among those sentenced to death. Soviet authorities also conducted trials in their zone of occupation. These trials established important legal precedents about individual responsibility for crimes committed under orders from superiors, helping to develop the modern framework of international criminal law. General Eisenhower's foresight in insisting on thorough documentation of the camps proved crucial. In the decades after the war, there would be some who would claim that the Holocaust had been exaggerated, that the reports from the camps were propaganda. But the extensive photographic and film evidence, the careful documentation of what was found, the testimony of both survivors and liberators, made such denial difficult to sustain. Eisenhower had understood that future generations might doubt the truth of what had happened, and his insistence on creating a comprehensive record helped ensure that the evidence would be preserved. The liberation of the camps also had a profound impact on how the world thought about human rights and international law. The revelation of what the Nazi regime had done led to the development of new international norms and agreements. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, adopted by the United Nations in 1948, was directly influenced by the Holocaust. The Genocide Convention, also adopted in 1948, defined genocide as a crime under international law and committed signatory nations to preventing and punishing such acts. These legal frameworks, developed in response to the Holocaust, would shape international relations and humanitarian law for decades to come. For the survivors, the liberation was just the beginning of a long journey of recovery and rebuilding. Many struggled with physical health problems for the rest of their lives as a result of what they had endured in the camps. The psychological impact was equally profound, with many survivors dealing with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, and other mental health challenges. Yet despite these struggles, many survivors went on to live productive, meaningful lives. They raised families, built careers, contributed to their communities, and in many cases, devoted themselves to education and remembrance, ensuring that future generations would know what had happened. The liberation of the concentration camps also gave rise to a commitment to remembrance and education. Survivors felt a deep obligation to bear witness, to tell their stories so that the world would remember. In the decades after the war, many survivors wrote memoirs, gave interviews, spoke at schools and universities, and participated in the creation of Holocaust museums and memorial sites. Their testimony became an invaluable historical resource, providing personal accounts that complemented the documentary record. Organizations like the USC Shoah Foundation have collected over 52,000 video testimonies from Holocaust survivors, creating a vast archive of first-hand accounts. The camps themselves were transformed into memorial sites, places where visitors could come to learn about what had happened and to honor the memory of the victims. Auschwitz-Birkenau, Dachau, Buchenwald, Bergen-Belsen, and other former camps became museums and memorial sites, preserved as evidence of Nazi crimes and as places of remembrance. These sites receive millions of visitors each year, people coming to learn about the Holocaust, to pay respects to the victims, and to reflect on the lessons of history. The date of January 27th, the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, has been designated by the United Nations as International Holocaust Remembrance Day. On this day each year, commemorative events are held around the world to remember the victims of the Holocaust and to reaffirm the commitment to preventing genocide. The liberation of the camps thus becomes not just a historical event, but an ongoing reminder of the importance of vigilance against hatred, discrimination, and mass atrocity. The survivors of the Holocaust became witnesses not only to what happened during the war, but also to the possibility of rebuilding after profound trauma. Their resilience, their determination to create new lives and new families, their commitment to bearing witness and educating others, all serve as powerful testaments to the strength of the human spirit. They took the worst that humanity had to offer and responded not with despair, but with determination to ensure that the world would remember and learn from what had occurred. As the years passed and survivors aged, their testimony became increasingly precious. With each passing year, fewer survivors remained alive to tell their stories firsthand. This gave added urgency to the work of documentation and education. Efforts intensified to record survivor testimony while it was still possible, to preserve their stories for future generations who would not have the opportunity to hear from survivors directly. Digital archives, video testimonies, and extensive oral history projects became crucial tools for preservation. The liberation of the concentration camps revealed to the world the depths of human cruelty, the capacity for systematic evil that existed within supposedly civilized society. But it also revealed the capacity for resistance, for survival, for rebuilding. The prisoners who lived to see liberation did so through a combination of luck and will, through small acts of resistance and mutual support, through the determination to survive another day, another hour, another moment. Their survival is a testament to human resilience. The liberators, too, were forever changed by what they witnessed. Soldiers who had thought they understood the nature of war, who had seen combat and death, found themselves confronting something beyond their experience or comprehension. Many struggled for years with what they had seen at the camps, with nightmares and memories that would not fade. But they also understood that they had witnessed something historically significant, that they had seen evidence of crimes that the world needed to know about. Their testimony, alongside that of the survivors, helped to create the comprehensive record of the Holocaust that we have today. As we reflect on the liberation of the concentration camps, more than 80 years later, we are reminded of the importance of remembering. The Holocaust was not an accident, not an inevitable outcome of forces beyond human control. It was the result of deliberate choices, of hatred allowed to fester and grow, of discrimination escalated to persecution, and then to genocide. It happened because people made choices to participate, or to look away, or to remain silent. And it ended because people made choices to resist, to fight, to liberate, to help. The liberation of the camps teaches us about both the worst and the best of humanity, about our capacity for evil and our capacity for good. The stories of liberation remind us that history is made by individuals, by the choices each person makes in moments large and small. The soldier who shared his rations with a prisoner, even though regulations said not to. The survivor who helped another prisoner when they could barely help themselves. The civilian who hid a Jewish family in their home. The liberator who insisted on documenting what he saw so that the world would know. Each of these individual acts of courage, compassion, and commitment to truth helped to bring an end to the Holocaust and to create the record that ensures we remember. As we close this account of the liberation of the concentration camps, we carry with us the obligation that comes with knowledge. We know what happened. We have heard the testimony of survivors. We have seen the evidence. And with that knowledge comes responsibility. The responsibility to remember, to teach, to speak out against hatred and discrimination wherever we see it, to work to ensure that such atrocities never happen again. The liberation of the camps was not just the end of the Holocaust. It was a call to the world to be vigilant, to be active in defending human rights and human dignity, to never again stand by while genocide unfolds. If you found this account meaningful, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue to bring you these important historical stories. Together, through learning and remembering, we honor the memory of those who did not survive and affirm our commitment to a future built on justice, compassion, and human dignity.